Selected pieces from the 14-hour radio presentation of On the Beatle Track, written and presented by Steve Mullane. John, Paul, George and Ringo, with a little help from their friends, on the Beatle Track. I'm Steve Mullane. In these programmes, we'll be listening to the most successful band of the 60s, or possibly more accurately of all time. I will be detailing a little of the Beatles' history, illustrated by their music. So come back with me to the late 50s, on the Beatle Track. On June 15th, 1956, a young man was taken to see the Quarrymen, a skiffle group run by one John Lennon. The young man's name? Paul McCartney. After hawking a very poor quality tape of the band playing at the Cavern around most of the major record companies, Brian finally convinced George Martin, Parlophone and EMI to give the Beatles a recording contract. On the 5th of October 1962, the era of the Beatles truly began with the release of this record. On their first American tour, a promoter from Kansas City appeared. There were no plans for the band to play his city, but, as he explained, he couldn't go home empty-handed. Brian Epstein said no. The man became angry, and in that great American tradition, reached for his checkbook. He wrote a check for $100,000. Brian said no again. Another check was written for $150,000. By the end of March, the Beatles were at number 88 in the Billboard Hot 100. They also held the numbers 84 and 78, 68, 49, 44, and 16, 5, 4, 3, 2, and this was the American number 1. Can't buy me love, love, can't buy me love. The businessmen believed that the fans would desert the band if their heroes were unobtainable, which only leaves George. On the first day of filming A Hard Day's Night, he was introduced to a young lady called Pattie Boyd. When we started filming, she said, I could feel George's eyes on me. She asked them all for their autographs. When it was George's turn, she asked for signatures for her two sisters as well. Pattie says that George put 2 kisses on each of her sisters' copies, but on hers, there were 7. She was pretty certain that George liked her. He did. The very pretty Pattie Boyd was soon Mrs. George Harrison. I give her all my love, that's all I do, and if you saw my love... And on August the 1st, 1965, ABC's Blackpool Night Out featured the band playing the songs from Help. Ringo introduced one song.
And I would like to do something we don't often do. Give someone a chance to sing because nothing sing. And there he is, all out of key and nervous, singing Act Naturally. Ringo!
September the 3rd, 1966 saw John Lennon fly off to West Germany to star in Richard Lester's latest film, How I Won the War, with Michael Crawford and Roy Kinnear. John had his Beatle cut trimmed to Army regulations for the film, and to be accurate, he didn't star in it, although the publicity and billing could convince you otherwise. It was Mr. Lennon's only effort at acting outside the confines of the group, and I have to say it was a pretty good try. Perhaps, though, it was a little before its time. It was a surrealistic anti-war film, which even with Mr. Lennon's involvement only rated a one-day showing in Cardiff. But first they joined Ringo on June 25th in a live television show that used all the latest technology to broadcast to an estimated 400 million people. It was called Our World. The boys were shown at Abbey Road putting the final touches to their next single. Introduced by the BBC stalwart Steve Race, we saw and heard George Martin count the band in to All You Need Is Love.
This is Steve Race in the Beatles recording studio in London, where the latest Beatle record is at this moment being built up. Not just a single performance, but a whole montage of performances. With some friends in to help the atmosphere, this is quite an occasion. All you need is love.
Revolution appears 3 times in the Beatles' discography, once as their 18th single, the first on the Apple label, and twice on the White Album. The first on the LP is a more soulful effort of the same song called Revolution Number 1. It's followed by Revolution Number 9, an altogether different composition. So far, although I've tried many times, I've never managed to play the whole of that track. It's a mixture of sounds and phrases repeated again and again that seems to go on and on and on forever. It's notable only for the appearance of another Beatles roadie, Mal Evans, who keeps repeating
Number 9, number 9, number 9.
It's usually about then that I move on to the next track. The Beatles' 18th single was, to my mind at least, their best. I loved Revolution for its power, but it was Paul's song that caught my emotions. And even now, if you ask anybody about the Beatles, they invariably mention the song that saw the band make their last live performance on television. On Sunday, September the 8th, 1968, the Beatles appeared with David Frost.
Magnificent. A perfect rendition. Ladies and gentlemen, there you see the greatest tea room orchestra in the world. It's my pleasure to introduce now in their first live appearance for goodness knows how long in front of an audience, the Beatles.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it bad.
On January the 2nd, 1969, the Beatles were at the Twickenham Film Studios, as was the film director Michael Lindsay Hogg. As the band were recording, the film crew began capturing scenes for what would be the Beatles' last film. It was to be a documentary, and it was a very difficult experience for all the Beatles. The cameras were turning on January the 10th when Paul and George got into an argument. Paul was still trying in his own way to organise the band, and although the Beatles were in need of a little discipline, Paul had none of Brian Epstein's smooth diplomacy. In the final version of the film, the argument itself is missing, as is George's statement that he was leaving the group. However, we do hear a rather depressed George saying,
"Play, whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. No, whatever it is that pleases you, I'll do it."
On May the 8th, 1969, John, George and Ringo named Alan Klein's Abco Industries as the official management of the Beatles. Paul McCartney was not mentioned. Paul was incensed. He had wanted as the band's managers John and Lee Eastman. With hindsight, it is possible to say that the lawyers would have made poor rock managers, but if they, rather than Alan Klein, had taken over the Beatles, the band may have lasted longer. Certainly, Mr. Klein was very unpopular with the normally freewheeling Apple employees. Chris O'Dell, an Apple secretary, explained the situation. He just moved in and started firing people. It took Alan Klein a full year to accomplish what he wanted at Apple, but it became a very uncomfortable year for the company. Then finally, on November the 15th, 1970, Paul filed suit against John Winston Lennon, George Harrison, Richard Starkey, Alan Klein, and Apple in an attempt to get officially dissolved the band. The case became very messy and protracted, but at last, on January the 9th, 1975, a London High Court judge ruled that the entity once known as the Beatles no longer existed.
I've got a feeling.
In order to put out of its misery the limping dog of a story that has been dragging itself across your pages for the last year, this is my answer to the question, will the Beatles get back together again? No. The dream was over. There are many times when I wish they had just let it be.
When I find myself in time of trouble, the
Dream is over.
On the Beatle Track was written and presented by Steve Mullane. The series was produced by Tony Harding.